All right, hello. Welcome to the Political Pariahs podcast. Two lifelong friends from childhood that are now entering our 30s, scary times.
Yeah.
And we like to talk politics and the news, economics and markets. Hey, George.
Hey, Jack. Thanks for having me on. This is fun.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our topic this week is trade and tariffs. We have been on and off talking about this since Liberation Day, which I'm going to splice in a clip right here of U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
These policies are the most important thing America has ever had.
And I just want to start there. Do you agree? Is this the most important policy that we have ever had in America? And is that just political exaggeration, or do you think Lutnick believes that?
Well, Jack, I think it certainly has the ability to be most important in the consequential sense. I don't know if that'll be necessarily in a good way that the administration or Lutnick maybe envisions when they say that. Um, but I think it certainly is going to have a huge impact, and it's going to be a defining moment in American history, probably over the course of the next 30 years. Kind of similar to what NAFTA was, right? Like, how long were we talking about NAFTA and debating it, debating the consequences of it, up until pretty recently, even though it was something that happened in the 90s. So I imagine that this is going to have the same impact, if not more, and it's going to be debated about, and the consequences of it are going to be faced over the next several decades, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if Trump and co. pull it off, and it's still way too early to even begin to speculate on whether they're actually going to pull it off. But if they do, it would mean a death to this neoliberal world order that Reagan and Thatcher kind of instituted of trade with us, even if it's imbalanced, even if it's whatever, but dollarize everything. And no one can break away from us, right? No one can leave. BRICS has been talking about it for years and years and years. And most of those countries are still very dollarized. They all own U.S. treasuries, right? Their bank reserves are becoming more gold, right? You still can't buy oil in anything but dollars from the Saudis. Let's get into the effects. What are going to be the effects if they pull it off?
Well, to be frank, I don't think that the US manufacturing base is going to return anytime soon. I think
Mhm.
the concept of it returning and revitalizing that in America would require, like you said, a total shift in the global um, trade order, right? Um, you would really need a hard reset for manufacturing to come back to the United States. Um, so that's something I don't think they'll pull off, frankly. And I think you are right. Like, these tariffs, this Liberation Day, this kind of split from promoting free trade and being the protectors of, the freedom of navigation and defending the seas, whether it's from piracy or state actors, whatever it may be. Pulling away from that um, is just taking us back to that age where we had more conflict, we had more division, we had more wars, and I would expect those things to kind of escalate, where we no longer have this mutual beneficial trade to keep us from each other's throats, and this big, some might say bully, some might say police officer with a stick patrolling the whole world. With us pulling away, you're going to lose that, and that certainly weakens the U.S. dollar. That weakens our ability to just print our debt away. Uh, which if that
Which we love to
stops,
do.
which we love to do, and if that stops, the American way of life, I think, is going to change significantly, and the growth trajectory of this country would change significantly. I think we would risk becoming somewhat of a stale empire, right? You see what happened to England, you see what happened to the Japanese economy, just stagnant, and I think we would really be at risk of that happening if we did see a shift away from the dollar as a consequence of us being a little bit more aggressive, I think, than we historically have been with our trade policy and weaponizing the dollar.
Yeah, I want to focus on. I think the great point you made here about the maritime order. I mean, since any of us listening have been alive, the United States has been the policeman on the water more than they have on land anywhere in the world. If you are a pirate, you fear the U.S. Navy. If you are a shadow Russian tanker trying to squeeze out whatever, discounted oil money that you can from the rest of the world because they have to buy it cheap if you're going to buy from the Russians now. Or Iran runs a shadow fleet as well. Like, you're afraid of the U.S. Navy. And part of that relies on the fact that we are guarding trade around the world. If we pull away from that, right, we reduce our spending, especially around Europe and in the Atlantic. We could see a return of a lot of these. I don't want to evoke Somali pirates per se. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about, but bad actors that don't trade like they could because we police it, right? And we watch over it. But if we are increasingly isolationist, that could be a big deal for global shipping. We've already seen like the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea that derailed a lot of shipping. It pulled a lot of money out of Egypt's pocket because of the Suez, right? And boats are just now going around the Cape of Good Hope and just sailing around Africa like it's the 1800s again because it's the safest way to go, and it reduces the insurance premiums for shipping. Something that I didn't think we would see in a world where the U.S. is the policeman. We should have bonked the Houthis with a stick a long time ago, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there's just so many critical choke points within the global trade routes that, if you have a few state actors, whether it's China shutting down a few choke points in Indonesia, or you have Iran shutting down their choke points, Turkey shutting down their choke points, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
When you lose that big stick and countries no longer respect that global order that has been established, you're just creating room for conflict. And I think this kind of ties back to the name of this podcast, right? Political pariahs, because that's one thing that really shocks me is when you look at Republican policy, like you said, Reagan, Thatcher, it's very pro free trade. We will protect free trade. If you get in the way of it, you're gonna you're gonna mess with the U.S. Navy.
NAFTA was redone as the USMCA, right? Which was effectively a very similar deal. We didn't change too much, but that was Trump 1, right? That was a Republican platform and the modern Republican platform. And that's being done away with too. And Trump doesn't like to say like who made that stupid deal because he made that stupid deal, but he calls it a stupid deal. He's like, the thing with Mexico isn't working. Right. It's not. And with Canada. Right. And those are our two largest targets that have not made trade deals yet.
Yeah.
And so I think we can kind of get into here the effects of tariffs. Right. If they don't make trade deals, and I think at this point he's kind of discounted Canada entirely. What does that do to us?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Because certainly it sounds like without a trade deal being made, this administration is very comfortable with just setting a very high tariff rate as punishment, right? Without really thinking of the repercussions. So I think for those countries that aren't going to bend the knee, which I think will be most of your large countries that have actual leverage, unlike, Madagascar, I'm sure will make a great trade deal, and Trinidad or whatever will make a great trade deal. But China is a lot less likely to bend the knee. And if you know Chinese culture, you know about their culture around saving face. It's very political there. There's so much about putting on an appearance. So they have to deliver this as a victory to their people. They cannot simply let a figure like Donald Trump steamroll them, right? That would completely discredit the CCP. Europe seems to want to stand in the way of Donald Trump as well. And I think we've done enough to piss off Canada that they're trying to hold firm as well. Ultimately, even when conditions are good, right? Like when you have good cooperation and diplomats are meeting with each other cordially, it can take over a year to do a trade deal. So to promise 200 of them in 90 days or within the first 6 months is very unrealistic, especially when you're going into it with kind of a hostile environment. Like the cooperation isn't necessarily on everyone's mind.
Even within the administration itself, right? There were reports of Greer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative, and Lutnick and Bessent. Bessent's the Secretary of Treasury. That they would take asides during the trade negotiations with the Japanese to argue amongst themselves because they weren't even very clear on what they wanted from the Japanese. So one of them would put forward, well, we want you to give up this or that. And they would take, wait. And they would take a side to debate their own policy. And it comes from this blitz, right? If you have to make, I mean, how do you make sense of so many trade deals all happening all at once? The top guys are involved in all of them because we want to present as this, you know, forceful, you're going to meet with the commerce secretary and you're going to make a deal. And then we get these deals like the Japanese deal that happened this week, where the Japanese have told their people, and this kind of echoes some of the Chinese sentiment. They told their people, we made no concessions, right? Like we got everything we wanted. Everything's great. And of course, they just lost an election and they need to kind of rejigger their base a little bit. But they said, we didn't give up anything. And truth be told, they didn't fix the rice import problem. They just said, we'll buy rice from the US instead of China. And it's become more of a way to punish China than it was to make an actual deal. We talked about Japanese car makers, right? And how they're dealing with it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With Japanese car makers, you know, willing to stomach the price cuts in order to offset the tariffs. So, you know, to a degree, I know we all clown on this administration for saying all these tariffs are going to be paid by foreign companies. Most will be paid by American consumers, but to a degree, this administration was correct. There are some companies and some nations that are willing to eat a loss, whether partially or fully, to help offset the costs. Whether that's sustainable in the long term, we'll see, you know, but the margins for a company like Toyota are a lot greater. So there is a lot more room for them to cut prices versus in agriculture and in minerals and natural resources, there is a lot less flexibility. So you're a lot more likely to see American consumers end up having to pick up that bill.
Yeah, the Madagascar vanilla plantations, right, don't have the same margins as Toyota.
Exactly.
Stephen Moran, who is the kind of chair of the Economic Advisory Council that consults with the president. So Moran's economic thought is very prevalent in Trump's policies. He initially reported that all of the tariffs were going to be eaten by the supply chain. That was kind of how he defended it. Was says we're not going to see any inflation. The supply chain will eat everything, and then the difference. So your prices will stay the same. Only now the Treasury is going to get a big cut. And truth be told, we have seen record tariff rake-ins. Right? We made in June we raked in 27 billion in tariff revenue, which is a drop in the bucket for the 1.3 trillion that we've already spent this year. Which is an unfathomable number. And that's how much we spent more than we made, right?
Right.
So it's going to fix a little bit of revenue. And the question really is that is inflation going to follow? And if so, like, is it going to be select products like we're seeing? Like cars may not increase as much because the car manufacturers can do it, but food might get worse. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly on the right track. I think different sectors are going to be hit harder than others. Some we might not really see a shift at all, as these companies will eat the cost of the tariff just to stay competitive with their American alternatives. However, there are many sectors like you said, food, where I think we're going to see great inflation. Home building, right? New homes and getting timber from Canada. I think you're going to see costs go up quite a lot, and that's exacerbating a housing crisis that's already quite horrible for most Americans throughout the country, right? This certainly is not going to help a new couple be able to afford a new home, like this administration has been saying is an objective of theirs, right? I believe Tucker Carlson was at Turning Point, and there's very few instances where I will agree with Tucker Carlson. But he gave a great speech about how most of the economic problems in America are down to the inability to afford a home. That we can show, you know, this tremendous GDP growth on paper, and we can talk about how we're prospering and growing. But if at the end of the day, your 30-year-old couple can't buy a basic starter home until they're 50, then we're not really doing better, are we? So I think that's certainly going to be a sector that's hit pretty hard.
I live in a deep blue state, California, and so we have the alternative solution to housing. Our solution was to just build giant apartment buildings everywhere, but they're luxury apartment buildings, right? They're not rent controlled necessarily. Some of them are rent stabilized, they call it. It's you pay into a rent bracket based on your income level, and that decides how much rent you will pay or not for these units. But the problem is as they go up, they're all priced like existing rentals on the market. Right. So they're not bringing the cost of housing down at all. They're just condensing people into an area, and that brings more demand, which raises rents and prices, and we end up with just more expensive housing that nobody owns but these big corporations that built the buildings, right? Because we're not building developments, and even some of them, like BlackRock, are buying these developments up because they are the ones who can absorb the demand.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and that's not just exclusive to California.
Yep.
For the listeners, I now live in a pretty moderate state. I live in Wisconsin in the Madison area, which I love because it's so moderate, but we face similar issues. Certainly, it's not like California. Homes here are about half the price, maybe less.
Yeah.
But for people from here and people who live here, they do feel that difference. They're used to seeing houses for sale for 250,000. Now they're 600,000. And the solution to that has been, let's build more apartments. And you're exactly right. We're seeing luxury apartments that are being exclusively rented by tech workers here, and it's awesome. They're really nice, but it's not doing anything to help folks here locally. It's doing great for people from California like myself who moved here. It's terrible for your average local person in Wisconsin, and it's not helping them out.
So to kind of refocus a little bit, I want to ask this question. Ultimately, what do you see as the purpose of tariffs? I have kind of a convoluted theory, so I'll let you go first, but why are we doing this?
The reason cited for it by Howard Lutnick, at least, I mean, we've heard so many reasons. We're going to bring manufacturing back to America. Then they kind of dropped that line and they said this is going to equal out our balance deficits, or trade deficits, which is simply impossible with some of these countries, right? We're just not going to export there as much as they're going to export to us.
Madagascar just can't buy enough F-150s to satisfy the trade imbalance because we want so much vanilla and other stuff that they produce that their population just can't afford. If you're a vanilla farmer, you don't make enough money to buy an F-150.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're talking about countries where some of them have a GDP per capita of like $35,000, or less, $5,000, 15. When you start getting into some of Far Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, those are pretty low figures. So it is hard for somebody living there to be able to afford any American products, even ones that aren't built in America, like an iPhone. So I just don't see that as being the reason. Ultimately, I think it was just a campaign promise, something that a politician campaigned on, something that maybe wasn't as well understood by people in that circle. And now it's just following through on that, just for the sake of I'm fulfilling my electoral agenda. I struggle to find like a consistent, realistic reason that I can look to and say, okay, I get this position. Maybe this could work. And it's hard to see that position because the administration keeps flip-flopping on it as well, right? Every morning you can turn on CNBC and you can listen to Howard Lutnick give a different reason.
And I see two kind of larger political themes here that I think we're getting at. And the Japan deal made this very clear to me. So part of it I see is this shut out China strategy, right? We
Right.
realized that anything we do to China, they try to subvert. Naturally, China's the other great power in our new multipolar world. So anytime that we can corral all the countries around China, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, and Japan, we're all in big focus here. We've already made a deal with Indonesia. They're going to get 19% tariffs and quote unquote open their markets to us. Although whatever that means is still unclear. Japan is also quote unquote opening its markets to us. But they didn't reduce or get rid of the rice tariff, which is like a 200% rice tariff and basically is a embargo on foreign rice. And this was a huge part of the trade deal, but they're totally open, whatever that means. But one of the things we are seeing is that in all these agreements, they're agreeing to cut out China or part of their deal with China. So we're going to import more rice, but within the existing quota. So who else sends rice to Japan? Thailand, Australia, and China. And if we can replace that part of the Chinese trade, then we reduce some of the income to China. I see the same things happening in the Indonesian trade deal, where we are trying to import our cars there instead of Chinese cars, which are typically cheaper and more ubiquitous across Asia, especially EVs. Right? China has been the king of cheap electric vehicles to just export. I don't know how good they are. I've never driven one, but they are way less than a Tesla or basically anything Ford and friends offer. The other thing I see is this vassalization process. And I hesitate to use that word because what a futile concept that is. But Trump sometimes acts in a very futile way. Part of the Japanese deal, one of the things that he said is the reason they got the deal done was because they agreed to pay us. And so they've agreed to make this 500, at first it was 400 billion, then it was 500 billion. Now it's 550 billion, although the Japanese still say 500. But they're going to take $500 billion and invest it in the US, possibly in this manufacturing push. And the question kind of becomes to me is like, is this how countries get out of it? Like, is this why the EU deal is stalling? Because the EU refuses to just pay us a huge chunk of money.
We have a 50-50 chance, maybe less than that, but a 50-50 chance of making a deal with the EU. And it'll be a deal where they have to buy down their tariffs, because they're right now at 30%.
I mean, Japan is they have the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world, right? It's like 200%. So it's not like they have money to just throw out and invest. They're going to borrow all of that money. And they're going to back up all of their borrowing with US treasuries, as they've done for the last 30 years. You know, if we are able to tie these countries to us in a very direct investment way, I see that as part of the trade deal purpose, is to kind of vassalize. Like, you're now tied to us even more than before. Before it was just you needed our military protection, right? Most of Europe doesn't have nuclear bombs, but they've got American nukes sitting in their territory that we have lent to them, just in case the Russian bear gets a little too crazy. And I don't think Russia is ever going to try and invade mainland Europe. I doubt that. The reason why they won't is because of our deterrence. And if Europe is able to get away from that deterrence, if they don't need us, how else do we keep them bound to us? And I think that maybe this investment deal, and I don't know if Europe will invest in us or not.
And I mean, I'm from Eastern Europe, right? This way of doing business, it's very Eastern European-esque, very extortion, you know, and you will invest, but you've been bullied into investing. Frankly, it's a very Russian-esque strategy. It kind of reminds me of, you know, as much as Russia complains about NATO, more Eastern European countries joining NATO, it's not like NATO instituted a regime change to get those countries to join. They joined because of years of these extortion type policies on behalf of Russia. So although we could be leveraging this to isolate China to some degree, I don't think it builds cooperation and trust with our allies, right? Like, sure, Japan might invest 500 billion, maybe, we'll see, right? We'll see. Those types of investments take years to materialize, and this administration might be long gone before that, you know, that comes due. So those things can change, but I don't think it helps us build trust with allies in the face of China. I think, you know, when you're looking at countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, who we also tariffed, even though we're supposed to be really protecting them right now more than ever, standing up for them and showing China that they shouldn't even try to invade. We want to deter it from ever happening, so we don't even have to answer the question of whether we will defend Taiwan or not with American lives. But when you start bickering amongst your allies so publicly, when you show within your administration that you don't really know what the goals are of these negotiations, and when ultimately your allies feel strong-armed and extorted to come to the table, I think that just weakens the alliance and builds distrust. And I think we've seen that in Europe specifically. Like, you've been talking about Europe kind of being reluctant to bend the knee, reluctant to make investments. I think that's certainly spilled over into the military sector, and them now trying, we'll see how successfully, but trying to shift away from the American defense sector and invest more domestically. We saw what happened with Rheinmetall stock on Liberation Day, and I think that's an indicator of what's to come. This certainly has an opportunity to kick off the European markets if they decide to not play nice with us anymore and shift their investments domestically in the EU. I think their markets could experience a revival at the detriment of ours, especially on the military side. I mean, you had American allies being worried about kill switches and F-35s around Liberation Day. And that's just an insane concept to think about, that, you know, we could have that level of distrust where now you have Canada looking at European aircraft manufacturers because they don't even trust Lockheed Martin not to shut off their aircraft in case of an incident. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I don't know if this is going to be a net positive or a net negative. Even if we get that investment, is it just a short-term gain that these countries are going to use to kind of keep us satisfied while they slowly shift away? And maybe in 50 years, we could find ourselves in a position like Russia, you know, where we're relying on a very limited number of sectors. For them, it's oil and gas. That's pretty much all they have. Whatever those few sectors are for us, and ultimately isolated from former partners and former, friends, brothers, cousins, you could say, purely because of these bully, I want to say, tactics on the global stage.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that now with the NATO spending increases, right? The Europeans tend to follow our lead in when it comes to NATO, right?
Yeah.
NATO has long been kind of seen as the US has a defense pact and everyone else is just a part of it. Fair
Yep.
enough. We are the largest contributor historically, right? We have troops all over Europe for this reason, and we place troops very strategically as this strategic tripwire of if you fire on any of our allies, you're likely to hit an American somewhere, and that gives us cause to jump in, even if you're not a part of NATO. So we've got advisors along all of the encampments, the bunker encampments in Taiwan. So if China invades, they're going to harm Americans.
Right.
And that brings us in even if we don't have a defensive pact. But, we're seeing this spending increase to replace us. That was kind of the way it was, is like, well, we're going to leave. We're not going to have the strategic tripwire, or at least not the way it is. And we're not going to put troops there. And you're just going to cover the spending. And I think Spain's prime minister had something very interesting to say about this. He said that the 5% spending target makes no sense to him because he's thinking about combat capabilities, right? If I can achieve the capability threshold that you need me to do, like if the Spanish army has to be able to accomplish certain things and have a certain readiness level, if he can do that with 3% of GDP or 2% of GDP, does it matter? And this kind of boils down to like, is the spending target kind of a way just to funnel a certain amount of the free world's GDP into defense contractors and historically American defense contractors? If we increase the spending, but we see the rise of these European contractors who have long been kind of on the back burner to companies like Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon, they get the increased spending and the increased spending away from America. That's a little dangerous for us.
Exactly. That's how I see it as well. And it's a little interesting to see this administration pursue it because, like we said, political pariahs, 20 years ago, if you told me a Republican was going to be the one pushing for America to pull away from NATO, pull away from being the world police when it comes to free trade, pushing for tariffs, these were inherently very left policies, during the Bush administration. Let's pull out of the Middle East. Why do we have American bases in Germany? I remember these conversations, these were very liberal talking points. So for now, the table to be completely flipped, where you have the Democrats being as the voice of, no, we need free trade. Why are you beefing with our allies? Let's not have tariffs. Let's keep our bases. Let's stay involved in NATO. Let's support Ukraine. To me, it seems like a total shift in political reality and what each party stands for. And I think perhaps a lot of your viewers feel the same way, where they feel like they're left a little bit outside from, having a home in a political party. Like the Democratic Party doesn't quite represent me. The Republican Party certainly doesn't anymore with some of the changes that they've made in their policy positions over the last decade. And it's been interesting to watch. You're right. Internationally, Europe is going to step up. We've seen Macron from France. He's been asking for a purely European defense pact for like as long as he's been in power, which is a while now. But he's finally making inroads there, right? Like he's really campaigning around Europe to shift away from America, no longer rely on them, and really start looking towards France as that European powerhouse. I think he's looking for France to take the mantle of the United States in Europe as well. That certainly would not be good for America or American defense contractors or the jobs that these American defense contractors provide in pretty much every single congressional district, right?
And this has long been one of the things that politicians have never been able to reduce military spending, right? We talk about military spending is such a huge part of our budget. And a lot of times it doesn't seem like it's being spent efficiently. And I won't get into the $30,000 screws or whatever, weird overcharges and things that we see from the defense industry. But I think we see a lot of this spending we see as kind of needless or spent inefficiently, but it must be done, right? And no politician on any side can reduce it because it's such a huge source of employment. I don't know if you watched a channel on YouTube called Smarter Every Day. This guy was trying to build a grill brush, like a scrub for a grill. And he's like, I want to build it in America. Can we do this? Can we get every part assembled in America? And he found out the biggest issue was bolts. He needed a single bolt to keep the grill scrub head on the body. he found out that if you buy those bolts from China, you can get them for about 5 cents. If you buy them from America, there's one manufacturer who makes these. They're in Massachusetts, and they charge 40 cents a bolt. And when he was talking to them, they said, we can't even source the steel for that cheap. Like, if we just took a big loss on all the labor and refinement, like, we can't even get the materials for 5 cents a bolt. And it kind of goes to this, like, why do they exist? They make bolts for aircraft because NATO has a rule that any aircraft you use has to have parts made from American or NATO country allied manufacturers, right? We can't, and good on us. I don't want F-35s bolted together with Chinese bolts, but it does kind of stand to like, so they have to charge a lot. We can't compete in that sector, and it makes it very difficult. And I think these tariffs and trade deals are going to exacerbate that problem. It's going to get worse.
Absolutely. And like you were talking about, even with taking a loss on everything else, just the raw resource costs cannot secure for that same price point per bolt. With these tariffs impacting a lot of raw resources like steel and timber, whatever else, you're going to see that impact almost every product, right? Where it's going to be difficult for American companies that do manufacture to compete just because those raw resources are expensive as well.
Last question. We're about to wrap up our time. Where are we investing because of this?
Man, I have been long on gold purely because of the international conflicts that have been spurring up. And, anytime there's wars, conflicts happening. I mean, just this past week, you had Thailand and Cambodia kick off where, they say border skirmishes, but there's F-16s dropping bombs. So it's a little bit more than that. There's conflict all over the world. That tends to be good for gold. So I'm long on gold. I've been long on defense. I'm sticking with certain healthcare picks. I think healthcare is going to remain pretty safe. Obviously, defense tech, going long on that as well.
It is to note about healthcare. I've been watching pharmaceuticals in particular. Our largest import from Europe is pharmaceuticals. So if we start seeing tariffs on those, American healthcare companies might be able to use that as a way to charge more and juice their margins, because we're seeing some of these companies in Europe and in Japan, whatever, reduce their prices. If the supply chain eats some of the drug pricing hikes that will have to happen, but the American healthcare system has no problem charging for drugs. And I see the rest of their business is mostly tariff immune, right? This is great. I'm also long gold, for the record. As part of my anti-dollar trade, I'm also long euros in this. I am not long Apple. I have been staying away from Apple. You can't avoid it because it's 5% of the S&P or something ridiculous. But I would be avoiding them in particular, as they've been in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. And I don't think we're going to manufacture iPhones in the U.S. anytime soon.
Same. I've been staying away from Apple, staying away from Tesla. I know there are a lot of people who believe in Tesla. We could talk about that someday. I'm certainly not one of them. And with pharmaceuticals, I think with drug prices, that is an area where the supply chain can absorb the cost. A lot of those price premiums are to cover years of R&D, which, you could certainly cut back on.
All right. I'm sure we could keep going, but that's our time today. If you're interested in following more of my work, you can find me, Jack Bowman, on Seeking Alpha, or my free newsletter, The Macro Obsession. George, I was going to ask where they can find you, but do you want to be found?
No, I don't, but they could find me on this podcast next week. So I'll see you all back there.
All right. See you next week, everyone. Thanks for listening.